Meet ABC News Nightline co-anchor Byron Pitts next on a special edition of Carpe Diem. Welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Marc Rosenweig, retired associate professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Our guest is Byron Pitts, co-anchor of Nightline and chief national correspondent for ABC News. He's a multiple Emmy-award winner whose journalism career spans more than 3 decades. Prior to joining ABC, he spent 15 years at CBS, where he was chief correspondent for the CBS Evening News and a correspondent for 60 Minutes. He's covered major stories including the 9/11 attacks, the Iraq War, and the Boston Marathon bombing. Byron is here today to receive the Allen B. Dumont Broadcaster of the Year Award from our school and to speak with students, and welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I got to tell you, this place is impressive. The students are impressive. This facility is magnificent, so I'm honored to be here.
And you were here in 2011 when you received an honorary doctorate, so it's great to see you back.
Thank you. Thank you.
You grew up in inner city Baltimore. With a single mom, and you wanted to be a journalist early in life. What gave you that spark? Why were you interested at an early age?
Well, a couple of reasons. My mom, her name is Clarice Pitts. She passed away 7 years ago. She was raised in church, and raised to believe, count it all joy, raised to believe that God has a purpose for all of us. And so early in life, I had some challenges. I didn't learn to read until I was almost 13 years old, and I spoke with a stutter until I was 20, my junior year in college. And so my mom and I saw that as something, a challenge that God had placed in my life for a reason, right? And so maybe communication, since those were things that came to me relatively late in life, might be part of my purpose. And the other motivation, I think, in part was growing up in Baltimore, very active in our home church, New Shiloh Baptist Church in Baltimore. Our church was fairly engaged in the civil rights movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so my mom, being a single parent, divorcee, couldn't afford childcare. She would take us every place. We would go to church events, and we would also go to demonstrations in the city because she was engaged. And I remember as a small child how the police would behave if reporters were present. Excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, young man. Step back. If there were no reporters present, oftentimes law enforcement would be far more aggressive. So as a very young child, I saw the power of the media to keep the powerful accountable, and that resonated with me. So I think seeing the role that the media played in our democracy. And my own challenges with communication, it seemed to make sense to us that maybe this might be my destiny.
Now, you mentioned that you were illiterate and a stutterer as a child. How did you overcome it?
Certainly grace. I can't emphasize enough from my own life experience how important that is to who I am. My mother's determination. I mean, it's an example of how. I mean, it's great if kids have 2 parents, but if you just have one. Who loves you, who supports you, who pushes you. Someone asked my mother once, how was she able as a single parent to send 3 kids to college? She said, oh, it was simple. I told each child, you will go to college or I'll beat you to death. And so it was that kind of high expectations from her and demands from her. My issues with literacy, there weren't any problems, there weren't any programs to assist me. But I was watching TV one day, and there was a program I saw on TV once, an advertisement for an adult literacy program for adults who couldn't read. Because currently in the United States, there are 30 million adults in our country who are functionally illiterate. And so my mother persuaded them to accept me in this program. So it was me and a bunch of truck drivers in this remedial reading program. Then with my stutter, I had a wonderful professor in college, a speech pathology professor, and we were in freshman year in college, and professors asked the question, so young people, what are your goals? And I said my goal was to be a journalist, and J words are words that I struggle with. So I stuttered, saying journalist. Classmates laughed. And so after class, this professor, Dr. Robinson, Paul Robinson, said, Pitts, what's the problem? I said, sir? He said, son, look, clearly there's a problem. He was old school, and he was not gentle in his approach to dealing with problems. And I loved him for it because my mother was kind of the same way. Anyway, he worked with me to figure out what my challenges were. And like we did things, for instance, like he would have me read the New York Times out loud with pencils in my mouth so I could feel what it felt like to speak properly. He would have me read the New York Times backwards so I could focus on the sound of each word. And then he did something crazy. He said, "Okay, you're gonna do a live radio show 2 hours a day." Like, what? So we're gonna face your fear head on. Oh, okay. And I don't think the average speech pathologist would necessarily recommend that today, but that's what we did, and he stayed with me, he encouraged me, as often happens in the university setting. There are a number of kids who may arrive in college who aren't fully prepared for the college experience. Doesn't mean they're not bright, it just means they're not fully prepared. And I was fortunate enough to have enough nurturing, caring professors who could see past my challenges and say, "Okay, we're going to help you." And I was fortunate.
Well, when you arrived at Ohio Wesleyan University in 1978, there was one professor who was not supportive of you and suggested that you leave. And then something happened on the steps when you were filling out the forms that turned it around for you.
I was failing freshman English, right? I think I was on academic probation longer than anyone in the history of Ohio Wesleyan. No one teases me about that now because I'm now on the board of trustees, so people don't make much fun about that anymore. I was failing freshman English, and this professor, now to his credit, I better appreciate this now. This was a professor who was committed to raising the academic standards of the university. So in his mind, having a student like me who was struggling so academically lowered the university standards, and therefore he thought it was necessary to sacrifice a kid like me to elevate the university. And so there's a school of thought that says, okay, we get that. So he told me, look, you're not Ohio Wesleyan material. I think you're wasting time, government's money. I think you should leave. I was 17 years old, raised to respect authority. So I left his office, went next door, and got the papers to withdraw from college. And as I was doing that, I started to cry because I knew in that moment I was not only letting go of my dreams, but my mother's dreams, the good people in my church, my siblings, my grandmama, my coaches, people who had lifted me to encourage me to this stage in life. And as I was crying, filling out these papers, a stranger walked by, true story. Didn't know her, she didn't know me. She simply said, "Young man, what's wrong?" Sat down and talked to me. Come to find out the stranger was actually a professor at OWU. She was an English professor. She was a first-year English professor. It was my first year on campus, her first year on campus. And I wasn't one of her students. But like so many wonderful educators in our country, on this campus, she saw a young person in crisis and offered to help. So she began tutoring me and working with me. Her name is Ula Luz. And I like to say that Ula didn't simply change my life, she saved my life and worked with me, and she remains a dear family friend to this day.
That's something that we emphasize to students too, the importance of mentors.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like from reading your memoir that all along the way, at various stops, you've had terrific mentors.
I call them angels. I mean, I've been so blessed. Some I sought out, others just kind of found me. And life has taught me, like, I don't believe in the bootstrap philosophy. I'm 58 years old. I've been a professional journalist for 36 years. I've never met one person who lifted themselves by themselves. And so I've been so blessed to have so many people who, in those times in life when you don't quite believe in yourself, you need people to believe in you. Also, there are times in life where you need to be humbled, where people need to check you. And it's nice to have people who who care about you genuinely and who can check you. And so I've been blessed to have people who've lifted me, who've encouraged me, and who've also checked me at times in my career.
You set goals for yourself as well.
Absolutely.
Your goal was to become a network correspondent by age 35.
Yes.
You came pretty close.
Yeah. I got the I got the job at CBS News about a month or so after I turned 35. But they actually had called me earlier, reached out to me sooner. So I would have had the job right at 35, but it came a little later. I was on vacation when they called. So technically, that prayer was answered by age 35. And to your point, like I believe deeply and setting goals. My late mom had a great saying. My mother used to say that every dream has an address. Every dream has an address. You can't get to where you want to go unless you know exactly where you're trying to get to. And you can't get there unless you have a plan to get there. And so for most of my life, I have daily goals, monthly goals, 1-year goal, 5-year goals, 10-year goals. So at age 18, freshman year at Ohio Wesleyan University on academic probation, my mother and I prayed that one day I would work for 60 minutes. Now I had friends like, yo, B, you need to get off probation, brother, first. I'm like, okay, we will figure that out, but there's a goal in mind.
And you talked about a number of addresses along the way.
Yeah.
You worked at about 7 local television stations to prepare yourself. How important was that experience, being on the road, so to speak?
Sure. Well, it caused my grandmother great shame. I mean, she had a hard time explaining to her girlfriends at church, like, why her grandson was changing jobs every 18 months. Because she'd say, well, baby, why can't you keep a job? You keep changing. But like, Mama, in my business, that's what's required. So I knew what my end goals were, and I knew the value of gaining experience. I mean, I think it's different from each person. What's the saying, to thine own self be true? I've known some people who have gone straight from college. Like, I have a colleague, Gio Benitez, at ABC News. Gio is awesome. He is fearless, he's courageous, and he's a good man. He's from Miami, Florida. And Gio got to the network like at 15. I think it's more like 24, but as a very young man. And that was Gio's truth. I'm someone, because of my issues with reading and literacy, like I read at the 10th grade level my freshman year in college. So I needed work. I needed to prepare myself. So my first job in TV was just to figure out the mechanics of television, to begin to gain some confidence. The second job in television was to decide, what kind of person do I want to be on the air? Do I want to be who I am, or do I want to have this TV persona? As we both know, some people in the profession choose that. Then I knew I needed to win awards. But I am a grinder, right? I've been that guy my entire life. I played sports. I played football in college. That's part of who I am. And it was Yogi Berra who once said, always dance with the one that brung you. And it certainly is my faith. And it is that notion of, I won't be first, it won't be easy, but I can get it done if I have a plan to get it done.
Let's talk about some of the major stories that you've covered, starting with 9/11. You were downtown within minutes of this happening. What kind of impact did that have on you at the time as a reporter and still today? Because when I talk to many reporters who were there, they carry it around with them.
Oh, it is the one story that lives with me every single day. It's the story by which I measure everything else that I do. I was a fairly young correspondent at CBS News. I had shown up to work earlier that day to work on a different project. It speaks to the value of just showing up early for life. And I get sent down there. I just moved to New York, so I didn't know where the World Trade Center was exactly. And I hop in a cab, and I look at the guy, says, take me downtown. I remember he turns around and looks at me like, you want to go where? I say, yeah, I need to go to the World Trade Center. And as we're going down the West Side Highway, I see it, and it's on fire. And at first I think, okay, it's just the largest house fire I've covered. Like, don't get worked up about it. You're prepared for this. You've seen this before. And then when I get there and I make my way near the base of the tower and towers, and I was standing with some New York City police officers, and we watch as a woman falls to her death. We could see her dress fluttering. And then a little later, we saw a man and woman hold hands and then jump from the building. And in that moment, I realized that this was going to be an ugly day. And covered it, was there for about 5 straight weeks. We were on the air for several days, as all the networks were. Then about 5 weeks later, I flew to Afghanistan and stayed there for a few months, covering that part of the story. I mean, it certainly, I think it changed me professionally. It made me, I mean, I'm a pretty serious guy in general, but it made me far more serious about my work. It reminded me again how precious life is, how important it is for the people that you love to say, I love you, on the way out the door. because I know so many people that morning weren't able to take advantage of that opportunity, and they never will again. And I think it changed our country. Yeah.
And to go from that almost immediately to Afghanistan, you describe again in your memoir how you and the famed producer Larry Doyle and others trekked through really the wasteland of that country and a lot of danger.
Yeah, we had a couple of close calls. In fact, when we got there in late October, I remember there was a stretch there, late October, early November, where something like 16 to 18 journalists were killed. It was the largest loss of life of journalists in modern history, and they died within 24 hours of it. I mean, it all happened the same day, and it changed the way certainly American journalists approached covering war. I mean, I think, for instance, the BBC was way ahead in recognizing that there are places dangerous for journalists to operate. We had a couple of close calls. And also in that moment, we had one experience where we thought it was going to end poorly for us. And I talk about this in the book. As a person of faith, it was a really powerful moment. Like there's a moment where we thought we might not make it. And I remember being really frightened in the back of our vehicle in the middle of the night in Afghanistan, someplace we shouldn't have been. And I was going to say the Lord's Prayer, which I was raised to learn, and I couldn't remember it because I was so frightened. I couldn't remember the prayer. And then eventually it came back to me. But in that moment, I realized that nothing, my training as a journalist, the amount of exercise that I do, my size, my strength, none of that would be enough to get me through this moment. That if it was God's will I die, I'm going to die. But if it's God's will that I live, I'm going to be all right. And I had such peace in that moment. And I've often said since then, I've had a number of times I've been frightened by things, but I've not been afraid because of what was revealed to my spirit in that moment about my own faith walk and about how I think life is.
You write that at one time you kept a tape of what you described as your worst work.
Oh, I still have it.
You still have it? Will you play it for us later at colloquium? Right. Why do you do that?
Someone told me once there are only two kinds of people. There are those who are humble and those who will be humbled. And I want to live in this space, hopefully professionally and in my personal life, to be as humble as I can. As I said, I'm a grinder, right? And I think I'm mindful that you can learn, I believe, perhaps more from losing than you can from winning. Because sometimes winning takes care of itself and it happens by accident, and but you kind of find out who you are in your mistakes. And so it reminds me to stay humble. That I've had some measure of success in this business, but I can still make mistakes. I still make mistakes. It just reminds me of who I am, where I come from. I'm a kid of pretty humble beginnings. And as opposed to being that talented, I've been blessed. I mean, I'm blessed to have been born in what I still believe is the greatest country on earth. Blessed to work in a wonderful profession with nurturing colleagues. Like one of my colleagues is here now. Kurt, hey brother.
Kurt's great.
He's awesome. He didn't have to come out today, but he came to support me and to support the university. And so I've had wonderful people in my personal life. I have a wonderful family. And so it's important for me to always stay grounded, to always look to get better.
What's your view of the forces affecting journalism today? We have the impact of social media. We have the impact of certain people claiming fake news and enemy of the people.
Who might that
and
be?
So on. I think your perspective is important on this. And how do you and your colleagues deal with this?
Certainly it's a conversation every single day, and I think I'm an optimistic person by choice, and so I see good in almost everything. So I think for me, I tell people often, there's never been a better time to be a journalist in my professional life than right now, because it's serious. You don't have to, in any newsroom across the country, you don't have to make a muscular argument to put serious news on television. And there was a time in which perhaps you had to do that because life seemed easy and fluff you could lead the show with something fluffy. Now because the stakes are so high, now because we're being watched so closely, we're being criticized from some powerful corners of the country, that it matters. Accuracy matters. Having things verified, having 3 sources of information. The old standards that I know you teach here at Montclair State University, who, what, when, where, and how, is that verified? Those simple blocking and tackling of journalism matter now. And so I think that's good for our profession, because I think one can make the argument there have been times that we've been sloppy. Now is not the time to be sloppy. I think what we're seeing now isn't new in world history. I mean, it's well documented what happened in Germany during the time of Hitler. One of the things the SS did was, first they discredited the news media, then they banned the news media, and bad things happen in the dark. That's true. Bad things happen in the dark. Part of what makes us a great nation is that we have a free press, that most mornings, most Americans can wake up and feel relatively comfortable believing that what they see on television, what they read in the newspaper, what they hear in the radio is true. And that's fundamental to who we are. And the fact that some people want to challenge that, I think challenge is okay. Reminds us that we need to be focused on doing our jobs well. So I think that's okay. I think technology is a double-edged sword. There are advantages. Certainly it allows us to do things quickly, more efficiently. We can produce clearer, better images now. But there's always a downside to it. I think back to the Vietnam War, for instance. In Vietnam, this isn't exactly right, but I'm close to it. In Vietnam, it took about 3 days from the moment a battle occurred till that battle was presented on television, just to process the film, get it out of the country, get it to the United States. And so in those 3 days, reporters, editors had a chance to check information. They had an opportunity to put events in context. Now, because of technology, we can report things live as they happen. And most of us aren't bright enough to give those moments their proper context live. Because everyone has access to a cell phone, anybody can say they're a reporter, anyone can present information as if it is fact. But it's still the job of journalists in this country to gather information, put it in context, and report it accurately.
Isn't that an issue too with social media, that
Sure.
What's real, what isn't,
Yeah.
who is claiming to be
Yeah.
a journalist, and
Yeah.
what have they checked out?
And I think eventually it will settle. I mean, you think about the early days of radio in our country. There were all kinds of outrageous programs on radio, and people pretending to be journalists, presenting themselves as journalists. And eventually it settled. I think back again to 9/11. It was Don Hewitt, the late founding executive of 60 Minutes, who said that in times of crisis, television becomes America's chapel, that we as a nation turn to television to be reassured that it's going to be okay. And I think in times of crisis that good and decent people in our country will rely on accurate information. I mean, right now, I think, people, there's some measure of division. I would argue this is not the most divided we've been as a nation. We've been divided oftentimes for a variety of reasons. But in crisis, people want information. Like, for instance, on September 11th, 2001, people wanted accurate information. They didn't want to hear anyone's opinion. They didn't want political discourse. They didn't necessarily want to point fingers of blame. They wanted basic information, and that's the responsibility of journalists.
Having said that, what do you see as the future of journalism going forward, and especially network news over the next, say, 5 years or so?
Now, granted, I'm the guy who around the office said it's going to be between Giuliani and Clinton for the White House. Okay, well, we see how smart I am. So it's always dangerous to ask me about the future and any journalist. But here's what I fundamentally believe. I mean, I think, sure, things will evolve. There's always talk that one of the networks may go away or whatever. But I tell people, especially young people who are interested in this profession, I tell people this, that as long as children like to hear stories whispered in their ear, there will always be a place for storytellers. As long as there's a United States of America that believes in democracy, that believes in free speech, that believes in the power of information, the power of the possible, there will be a place for journalism. What form it takes, who knows, right? Because there was a time in which most people got their information from newspapers, and people scoffed at television. The great Edward R. Murrow at CBS News. Edward R. Murrow thought that television was a passing fancy. He thought real journalism was done in the newspaper or in radio. Okay. And so who are we to say what it will look like 50 years from now? But I am willing to believe that the United States of America will exist down the road, that people will still want accurate information, and there will still be people willing who have the courage and the conviction to still go places and tell people the truth.
So you're optimistic about millennials wanting to know what's happening
Oh,
every
I think
day?
so. I
Yeah,
think
all
so.
right.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Just because I think, I mean, young people in our country are wonderful. I mean, meeting, just saying hello to the number of young people I've met here in the studio today. When I met the crew, I mean, they're professional. They shook my hand. They looked me in the eye. When I met the students in the control room, you could see their enthusiasm about their profession, their level of professionalism. So yeah, I mean, I think America is in good hands. I think, yes, we have challenges, but we're still a nation of good people. I think one of our great strengths are the immigrants who come to because we are a nation of immigrants, right? All of us came here by boat at some point.
Yes.
Some willing, some unwilling. But we all got here, most of us got here by boat. And I think we figured out. And so I think the millennials, this young, dynamic generation, they will figure out what they need to figure out, and they will elevate our country. They will push us forward, and you know, we'll be fine.
What is your legacy in journalism, do you think? How would you assess it?
Oh, gee. You know, I want to believe that I want to believe that that I've honored our profession. I want to believe that there will be a group of journalists who can say, yeah, I knew Byron Pitts, and yeah, he encouraged me. He critiqued my resume tape. He was kind to me. He set a good example. Yeah, and that's, I'm good with that. You know, when I think about, because certainly, you know, for all of us, we get a certain age, we think about our legacy. Right now, I'm mindful that I think more about my family. You know, my children, my grandchildren.
Well, since you mentioned that, you have a very accomplished family, but I had the pleasure of seeing your daughter Christiane in King Kong the other night. Come up.
My baby girl, there she is.
There she is with her co-star.
That's right.
And a phenomenal singer and actress, and I know you're very proud. We were talking about it earlier.
Yeah.
And I have to ask you, though, did she get that from you, from the church choir?
Oh, it had to be the church choir, right? She sang in the church choir. She's a product of the Montclair public school system. This has been her dream since she was 8 years old. If she's got nothing else from me, she certainly didn't get her talent from me. But I think her drive, her commitment to having goals, I'm so very proud of her, and as are her siblings and our family. Proud of her, proud of all of our kids.
Thank you so much for being with us
you,
today. We'll look forward to introducing you to students at Colloquium. Congratulations on the award.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us as well. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Marc Rosenweig from all of us at Montclair State University. Thanks for watching Carpe Diem.